tiny bird cleaned the wounds of a sleeping elephant. The next day, she found the forest waiting for her song. The blood came first, dark rivulets threading through gray wrinkles, pooling in the deep folds where the bull elephant's shoulder met his flank. The oxpecker arrived in silence, a flash of russet and yellow against the dying light, her sharp beak already open, her black eyes fixed on the torn flesh where the snare had cut deep into ancient skin. She landed without hesitation on the mountain of breathing stone, and the elephant, exhausted, feverish, barely conscious beneath the acacia, did not stir. His breathing was shallow, labored. Flies had already begun their work. But the bird moved with precision, her small head tilting, examining the wound's edge where metal had carved through hide thick as timber. And then she began to clean. Not to feed, to clean. Her beak worked carefully, removing debris, clearing infection, her movements deliberate as prayer. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The great bull had been dying for 3 days. He had crossed into the Thornveld from the north, dragging the wire behind him like a second shadow. The snare embedded so deeply that each step pulled the metal tighter against muscle and bone. Poachers had set it for antelope near the waterhole, but the old elephant, 60 years of wisdom carved into his tusks, his body a living map of droughts survived and rivals defeated, had stumbled into it during the night. And the cable had done what steel always does to flesh. It had cut and held and refused mercy. By the time he collapsed beneath the acacia, he had traveled 40 kilometers. His herd had tried to follow, the matriarch pressing her trunk against his wounded side, the juveniles calling in voices that shook the baobabs. But he had turned them back with a low rumble that meant go, that meant live. And they had obeyed because elephants understand finality in ways that break the heart of anyone who watches them mourn. Now he lay in the red dust of the Savudi, barely breathing, his great body still as stone, except for the slow rise and fall of his ribs. Vultures circled overhead, patient as death itself. A jackal watched from the shadows, waiting. The sun had set behind the escarpment, turning the sky the color of old blood. And in that suspended moment between day and night, the oxpecker arrived. She was small, impossibly small against the enormity of the dying bull. Her scientific name was Buphagus erythrorhynchus, red-billed oxpecker, but names meant nothing here. What mattered was instinct. What mattered was the ancient contract between her species and his, a symbiosis written into their genes over millennia. She lived on elephants. She fed from elephants. She kept them clean of ticks and parasites, and in return, they carried her across the vastness of Africa, a living landscape beneath her feet. But this was different. The wound on the elephant's shoulder was not an infestation of parasites. It was trauma, deep, infected, lethal. The metal had peeled back skin and muscle, exposing tissue that should never see air. Blood had dried in black crusts around the gash. Pus had begun to form where bacteria had entered. And the flies, always the flies, had laid their eggs in the wet darkness of the wound, their larvae already beginning to hatch. The oxpecker landed on the elephant's spine and went still. Around her, the world continued its indifferent turning. A fish eagle called from the distant river. Cicadas began their evening song. The wind moved through the acacia branches with a sound like rushing water. But the bird remained motionless, her head cocked, her bright eye fixed on the terrible wound below her. Something in her shifted. It was not thought, not in any human sense. It was deeper than thought, older than language. It was the thing that makes a mother bird return to a nest even when the tree is burning. The thing that drives a wolf to stand between her pups and a bear. The thing that, occasionally, rises in one species toward another with a force that resembles what humans call compassion, but is something both simpler and more profound. She hopped down the elephant's flank, her claws finding purchase in the deep wrinkles of his skin. She moved toward the wound with the careful deliberation of a surgeon approaching an operating table. When she reached the torn flesh, she paused, just for a moment, and then she began. Her beak was not designed for this work. It was made for plucking ticks from hide, for grooming and feeding. But she used it now with extraordinary precision, carefully removing the dead tissue at the wound's edge, the dried blood that blocked healing, the debris that had collected in the torn skin. She worked methodically, section by section, her movements economical and sure. The elephant did not wake. His breathing remained shallow, irregular. But something in his massive body seemed to ease, some infinitesimal relaxation, as if even in near unconsciousness he felt the difference between harm and help. The oxpecker worked through the twilight. She removed fly larvae one by one, her beak delicate as forceps. She cleaned away the accumulation of infection, exposing the raw flesh beneath. It was work that should have taken hours, work that should have been impossible for a bird weighing less than 2 ounces. But she persisted with a focus that bordered on obsession. When darkness finally came, complete and sudden as it always does in Africa, she did not leave. She hopped to a position just above the wound, settled her feathers, and kept watch. Her eyes, adapted for daylight, could see little in the blackness, but she remained, a small guardian against the night's predators, against the flies that would return with dawn, against the infection that was trying to take the elephant's life. The bull's breathing changed sometime after midnight, became slightly deeper, slightly more regular. His fever broke just before dawn, sweat darkening his skin, and when the first gray light touched the eastern horizon, the oxpecker began her work again. This time, she sang while she worked. It was not the harsh chatter that oxpeckers usually make, the alarm calls and territorial warnings. This was something else, a soft, rhythmic chirping, almost melodic, that rose and fell with the rhythm of her movements. It sounded, impossibly, like comfort. The elephant's ear flickered. His eye, the one the bird could see, opened slightly, a sliver of brown iris in the gray light. He did not move, but something in that eye suggested awareness, recognition perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that he was not alone. The sun rose, indifferent and eternal, burning away the last of the night's coolness. The wound was cleaner now, not healed, but cleaned of the immediate threats. The oxpecker had done what she could. The rest would depend on the elephant's own massive immune system, on his will to survive, on luck, and the million small factors that determine whether a wounded animal lives or dies. She should have left then, should have flown to find a healthy host, a moving elephant that could carry her to food and water. But instead, she remained on the bull's shoulder, her small body casting a smaller shadow across his skin, and something passed between them that transcended the usual boundaries of interspecies interaction. It was a proposition, though neither understood it in those terms. The bird would stay. She would tend the wound, keep it clean, guard against infection. And the elephant, if he lived, would carry her. Not as livestock carries a parasite, not even as host carries symbiont, but as one survivor carries another through the valley of death, bound by something older than either of them, something that had no name in any language, but that both recognized in that moment as their only chance. The bull closed his eye again. His breathing steadied, and the small bird on his shoulder settled her feathers and began to sing once more, a sound so quiet it could barely be heard, but one that seemed to say, "I am here. I will not leave. We will face what comes together." The sun climbed higher. The day's heat began to build, and in the shadow of the acacia, the impossible alliance took its first breath. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The elephant rose on the fourth day. It was not a sudden recovery. Nothing in nature happens suddenly, except death and birth, and even those take their time when you look closely enough. The bull's return to consciousness was gradual, measured in small victories. An ear that twitched to drive away flies, a trunk that lifted slightly to test the air, and finally, near midday when the heat was brutal and honest, the slow, agonizing process of getting 4 tons of injured animal back onto its feet. The oxpecker flew to a low branch and watched. She had not left his side, except to drink from a small puddle formed by the morning dew in a baobab's hollow. She had not fed, not truly. A few ticks from the elephant's uninjured side, consumed more from habit than hunger. Her weight had dropped. Her feathers had lost some of their luster, but her eyes remained bright, focused, tracking every movement of the massive body below her. The bull's first attempt to stand failed. His leg splayed, his wounded shoulder buckled, and he crashed back to the earth with a sound like thunder. Dust rose in a cloud around him. He lay there, breathing hard, his trunk curled against his chest in what might have been pain or might have been determination. The bird returned to him immediately, landing on his head between his eyes, and she sang. It was the same soft chirping she had used before, but there was urgency in it now, a rising and falling pattern that seemed to say, "Try again, try again, try again." The elephant's eye rolled toward her, and for a moment they looked at each other. Predator and prey reversed, the tiny urging the titan, the fragile pushing the indestructible toward survival. He tried again. This time he got his front legs under him, his massive head rising from the dust, his tusks, yellowed and cracked from decades of use, pointing toward the sky. His back legs remained folded, but he was halfway up now, halfway back to the world of the living, and the effort was costing him everything. His wounded shoulder screamed. Fresh blood seeped from the cleaned gash, but he pushed, and with a final surge that seemed to pull strength from the earth itself, he stood. The oxpecker took flight, circling once around his head, and then landed on his back, just behind his shoulders where she could reach the wound without interfering with his movement. She began to clean again immediately, working at the fresh blood, keeping the flies away, her small body bouncing with each of the elephant's labored breaths. They stood there together for a long moment, the elephant swaying slightly, relearning balance, and the bird riding him like a ship rides the ocean, steady and sure despite the motion beneath her. Then the elephant began to walk. It was not the confident stride of a healthy bull. It was slow, painful, each step carefully measured. His wounded leg dragged slightly. His head hung lower than it should. But he was moving, and movement meant life, meant possibility, meant that the decision to survive had been made. The bird sang as he walked, a continuous stream of soft chirps that seemed to mark rhythm, to provide something steady in the chaos of pain and recovery. And the elephant, whether he understood or simply accepted, kept walking, step by agonizing step, away from the place where he had almost died and toward whatever came next. They traveled toward water first. Instinct drove them both. The elephant needed to drink, needed to cool his fevered body. And the bird knew that water meant other elephants, meant the possibility of food, of a return to the normal patterns of survival. The nearest permanent water was the Savuti Channel, 8 kilometers to the east, a journey that would take a healthy elephant 2 hours, but would take this wounded bull most of the day. They walked through heat that shimmered and lied, that turned the distant tree line into liquid, that made the air itself seem hostile to life. The elephant stopped frequently to rest, his trunk hanging limp, his eyes half closed. During these stops, the bird would work on his wound, cleaning, always cleaning, fighting the constant battle against infection and decay. She would also scout ahead, flying in short bursts to check for threats, lions that might see a wounded elephant as opportunity, hyenas that would follow and wait for weakness to become terminal. Twice she gave alarm calls that made the elephant change direction. Once for a pride sleeping in the shade of a marula tree. Once for a territorial bull who would not tolerate another male in his territory, wounded or not. The elephant seemed to trust her warnings. He would alter his course without question, as if understanding that the small bird on his back could see what he could not, could protect him in ways his size and strength no longer could. By late afternoon, they reached the channel. It was low. The dry season had pulled the water down to a narrow stream, barely a meter wide. But it was water, clear and cold from underground springs, and the elephant entered it with something like relief. He stood in the shallows, letting the current wash around his legs, and then he began to spray water over his back, over his wounded shoulder, using his trunk like a hose. And the bird flew to a nearby branch and watched the ritual of healing, of relief, of a body trying to remember what it felt like to not hurt. Other elephants appeared as the sun touched the horizon, a small bachelor herd, young bulls who had not yet challenged for territory, who traveled together in loose alliance. They approached cautiously, trunks raised to scent the air, ears spread to catch any sign of threat. When they recognized the wounded bull, perhaps by smell, perhaps by some other elephant sense humans cannot measure, their behavior changed. They surrounded him, not aggressively, but protectively. They touched him with their trunks, gentle explorations of his wound, his face, his tusks. They rumbled in voices too low for human ears to hear, but that vibrated through the ground, through the water, through everything. The oxpecker watched from her branch, her head tilted, her bright eye tracking the interactions. She had never seen elephants behave this way toward a bull. Usually, males were solitary or competitive, not nurturing, but these young bulls seemed to understand that one of their own was hurt, and they responded with something that looked remarkably like compassion. One of the young bulls, his tusks still short, his skin still relatively smooth, positioned himself between the wounded bull and the direction from which predators usually came. Another began pulling down branches from an acacia, placing them within easy reach of the injured elephant's trunk, offering food. A third simply stood close, his massive body a wall of protection and solidarity. The wounded bull ate slowly, his trunk moving with deliberate care, and the oxpecker returned to his back, settling into her position just above the wound, her usual spot now, the place that had become hers through the alchemy of crisis and care. Night came again, but this time they were not alone. The bachelor herd settled around the wounded bull, creating a living fortress of flesh and loyalty. The oxpecker slept on his back, her small body warm against his cooling skin. And for the first time since the snare had cut into him, the elephant seemed to rest without the constant tension of a body expecting death. The days that followed established a pattern. The bachelor herd would move to new feeding grounds, and the wounded bull would follow at his own pace, sometimes falling behind, sometimes needing hours to cover distances the others crossed in minutes. But they always waited. They would feed and then circle back, checking on him, encouraging him with low rumbles and gentle trunk touches, creating a moving sanctuary that kept the predators at bay. And through it all, the oxpecker remained. She tended his wound every morning and evening, the times when flies were most aggressive. She kept watch while he slept. She warned him of dangers he could not see. She had begun to feed again. The wound was healing enough that she could take ticks from his other side without risking infection. But she always returned to her position above the gash, her station, her purpose. The elephant seemed to listen for her now. When she chirped, his ear would swivel toward her. When she flew off to scout, he would pause and wait for her return. A communication had developed between them, wordless but precise, a vocabulary of sounds and movements that transcended the normal boundaries between species. But the wound was not healing as quickly as it should. The gash remained open, raw, weeping fluid that attracted flies despite the bird's best efforts. The elephant's strength was returning. He could walk farther each day, feed more normally, but the wound itself seemed stuck in a permanent state of beginning to heal without ever actually healing. Infection lurked at its edges, held back but not defeated, waiting for any opportunity to advance. The oxpecker could clean, but she could not close the wound. She could remove debris and parasites, but she could not repair torn muscle and severed blood vessels. She was reaching the limits of what her care could accomplish, and some instinct in her small brain understood this, registered it as a problem she could not solve alone. She began to call more frequently, not the soft comfort chirps, but louder, more urgent sounds. She would fly in circles above the elephant, calling and calling, as if trying to summon something, someone, some force that could provide what she could not. The elephant watched her with what might have been curiosity. The bachelor herd watched her with what might have been confusion. But she continued calling, day after day, her voice rising above the general noise of the savannah, a small prayer cast into an indifferent sky. And then, on the 9th day after the elephant had risen, something answered. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The human came at dawn, when the light was still gray and uncertain, when the boundary between darkness and day was porous and strange. The oxpecker saw him first, a tall figure moving through the bush with the careful silence of someone who understood the rules of the wild. He was alone, carrying a pack and a rifle, dressed in the cocky colors of rangers or researchers, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The bird's first instinct was alarm. Humans meant danger. They were the ones who set snares, who poached ivory, who destroyed without reason. And then, on the 9th day after the elephant had risen, something answered. She launched from the elephant's back with a harsh cry, circling above the approaching figure, her calls sharp and aggressive, warning the bachelor herd, warning the wounded bull, warning everything with ears that threat was coming. The elephants responded immediately. The younger bulls formed a defensive line, their ears spread wide, their trunks raised to catch the human scent. The wounded bull tried to move behind them, but his damaged shoulder made retreat slow, painful. He turned to face the human instead, his tusks lowered, his body language saying what elephants always say when cornered: "Come closer and die." But the human stopped at a safe distance. He raised his empty hands, showing no weapon, no threat. And then he did something unexpected. He sat down, simply lowered himself to the ground, cross-legged, making himself smaller, less threatening, and waited. The oxpecker continued to circle, calling, but her cries became less urgent. Something about the human's posture, his stillness, suggested patience rather than aggression. She landed on a termite mound 20 meters away and watched, her head cocked, her body tense and ready to fly. The human waited. The sun rose fully, burning away the last of the cool morning air. Flies began to swarm. The elephants remained tense, alert, but the human did not move. He simply sat, his hands visible, his breathing steady. And after an hour, then two, the bachelor herd began to relax. One of the young bulls lowered his trunk and began to feed. Then another. The defensive line dissolved gradually, naturally, as the elephant's assessment of threat shifted from immediate to uncertain to possibly not dangerous. The wounded bull was the last to ease. He kept his eyes on the human, his trunk testing the air constantly. But eventually, exhaustion and pain overruled caution. He needed to rest. He needed to feed. And the human, whatever his purpose, was maintaining distance, showing submission, behaving in ways that suggested he understood elephant social structure. The oxpecker flew back to the bull's shoulder. She resumed her position above the wound, but she kept one eye on the human, tracking his every movement. Slowly, so slowly it seemed like time itself had thickened, the human stood. He moved with deliberate care, his hands still visible, his body language screaming non-aggression. He approached not directly toward the elephants, but at an angle, giving them space to flee if they chose, showing respect for their size and power. When he was 30 meters away, he stopped again. He reached into his pack carefully, his movements exaggerated and slow, and pulled out what looked like a small device with a camera attached. He set it on the ground, aimed it toward the wounded bull, and then retreated back to his original position. The oxpecker understood none of this, but she recognized observation when she saw it. It was what she did, after all, watching and monitoring and gathering information. The human was doing the same thing, using his tools to see what his eyes alone could not fully comprehend. The day passed in strange tension. The human remained at his distance, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, but always maintaining the same careful, non-threatening posture. He drank from a water bottle. He ate something from his pack, but mostly he just watched, and the camera device recorded. And the elephants gradually accepted his presence, the way they might accept a strange bird or a lost antelope, not welcomed, not trusted, but tolerated. As evening approached, the human did something that changed everything. He pulled from his pack a small medical kit, white plastic with a Red Cross symbol, and he held it up where the elephants could see. And then he placed it on the ground and stepped away from it. The oxpecker flew to investigate immediately. She landed near the kit, hopping around it, examining it with her sharp eyes. It smelled strange, chemicals and plastic. But there was something else in the scent, something that reminded her distantly of healing, of the rare times she had found wounded animals that had somehow recovered against all odds. She chirped softly. The sound was not alarm, but curiosity, question. The elephant's ear swiveled toward her. And then the human did something extraordinary. He began to sing. It was not like the oxpecker's song, not high and chirping and rapid. It was low, melodic, with words the bird could not understand, but with a rhythm that resonated somehow, that seemed to acknowledge the wound, the pain, the struggle to survive. The tune was simple, repetitive, and there was something in it, some quality of compassion or recognition, that made the oxpecker tilt her head and listen. The elephant listened too. His trunk lowered slightly, his ears relaxed. The human sang for perhaps 5 minutes, and then he fell silent. He gestured toward the medical kit, made a motion with his hands that could have meant anything or nothing, and then he stood and began to walk away, back into the bush, his rifle still slung across his back unfired, his purpose unclear but somehow not hostile. The bachelor herd watched him go. The wounded bull watched him go. And the oxpecker flew to the medical kit and examined it closely, her bright eye taking in every detail, her instinct trying to solve the puzzle of what it was and whether it represented threat or salvation. Inside the kit were sealed packets, strange implements, and, she could smell it now, medicine. Antibiotics, probably, though she had no name for such things. materials meant to clean and close wounds, to fight infection, to give damaged tissue a chance to heal. But the kit remained closed. The bird could not open it. The elephant could not understand its purpose. And the human, who could have used its contents, had walked away, leaving the solution close but unreachable, a test or a gift or a tragedy of good intentions and impossible communication. The oxpecker called after the human, her voice sharp, frustrated, but he did not return. He vanished into the dusk like smoke, and the medical kit sat on the ground like a monument to the unbridgeable gap between species, between instinct and knowledge, between caring and capability. That night, the wound worsened. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps the stress of the human's presence had weakened the elephant's immune system. Or perhaps the infection had simply reached a critical mass, and the bird's cleaning, however dedicated, had finally proven insufficient to hold back the tide of bacteria and decay. The elephant's fever returned, higher than before. He did not sleep, but stood swaying in the darkness, his breathing labored, his body trembling with chills despite the warmth of the African night. The oxpecker stayed on his back, pressed against his skin, feeling the heat radiating from his wound, feeling the tremors that ran through his massive frame. By dawn, the bull had collapsed again. The bachelor herd gathered around him, touching him with their trunks, rumbling their concern, but they could do nothing. Elephants cannot heal wounds with their trunks, cannot fight infection with their devotion. They could only witness, only grieve in advance, only stand guard while one of their own slipped toward death. The oxpecker left the elephant's side and flew to the medical kit, which still sat where the human had placed it. She landed on it, calling, as if by sheer force of will she could make it open, make it reveal its secrets, make it save the life of the elephant who had become more than host, more than carrier, more than the simple symbiotic relationship her species had evolved to exploit. But the kit remained sealed. And the elephant's breathing became shallower, and the sun rose on what looked like it would be his final day. The oxpecker flew in frantic circles, calling and calling, her voice rising in pitch and desperation. She flew to the direction where the human had disappeared, calling toward that emptiness. She returned to the elephant, landing on his head, on his trunk, on his wounded shoulder, as if her presence alone could anchor him to life. But the bull's eye had closed. His breathing came in irregular gasps. The bachelor herd had gone silent, their rumbles ceased, their trunks hanging limp in what looked like despair. And then, from the bush where the human had vanished, a new sound emerged. It started as a low hum, mechanical, rhythmic. Then it grew louder, resolving into the distinctive chop of helicopter blades. The oxpecker launched into the air, her alarm call piercing, but her cry was drowned out by the approaching thunder of rotors and engine. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, small and white with red markings. It circled once, assessing the situation, and then it began to descend toward a clear area 50 meters from where the elephant stood. The bachelor herd panicked. They scattered, trumpeting in fear, their survival instinct overriding their loyalty to the wounded bull. Within seconds, they had vanished into the bush, leaving the collapsed elephant alone, except for the small bird who continued to circle above him, calling into the chaos. Her voice lost in the storm of noise and dust kicked up by the helicopter's descent. The bird's world had fractured. Everything she understood, the quiet rhythms of the savannah, the steady presence of her elephant, the predictable patterns of survival, had shattered in the span of minutes. Threat had arrived in a form she could not fight or flee from, carrying with it the potential for salvation or final disaster, and she had no way to know which. The helicopter landed. Its door opened. and human figures emerged, carrying equipment, moving with urgent purpose toward the dying elephant. The oxpecker had a choice to make: flee with the bachelor herd to safety, or stay with the elephant and face whatever came next. It was not a complex decision. It was not even really a decision at all. It was simply who she had become over these days of tending and watching and bonding, a transformation she could not name and did not understand, but that made the choice inevitable. She descended from the chaotic air and landed on the elephant's head, between his closed eyes. And she lowered her body against his skin and stopped calling. She would stay. She would bear witness, and if this was the end, she would not let him face it alone. The humans approached, and the world held its breath, and the thin thread of the elephant's life hung suspended between hope and oblivion. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. There were 3 humans, 2 women and a man, all wearing the same khaki uniforms, all moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience with wildlife emergencies. The oxpecker recognized one of them immediately, the human from before, the one who had sat and sung and left the medical kit. He carried the rifle still, but it hung loose across his back, unthreatening, and his attention was entirely focused on the collapsed elephant. The lead woman, tall, her dark hair pulled back, her face showing both determination and something that might have been grief, knelt beside the elephant's wounded shoulder. She examined it with careful hands, her fingers gentle against the torn flesh. And even from her position on the bull's head, the oxpecker could see the woman's expression change from concern to alarm. "It's septic," the woman said, her voice cutting through the helicopter's dying whine. "Advanced infection. I'm surprised he's still alive." The other 2 joined her, and they began unpacking equipment, syringes, bottles of liquid, bandages, instruments the bird could not identify. The man who had been there before approached the elephant's head slowly, speaking in low, soft tones, and his hand reached out to touch the bull's trunk, a gesture of acknowledgement or apology or both. The oxpecker watched it all from her position, her body pressed flat against the elephant's forehead, her eyes bright and unblinking. She did not flee when the humans came close. She did not call alarm. Some instinct told her that these humans were different from the poachers, from the dangers she usually warned against. These humans had brought the helicopter, not to take, but to give, not to kill, but possibly to save. The lead woman noticed her. Their eyes met for a brief moment, human and bird, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared purpose perhaps, or simply mutual acknowledgement that they were both trying to keep the same life from ending. The woman nodded slightly as if granting permission for the bird to stay, and then she turned back to her work. "Starting IV antibiotics," she announced, and one of the syringes went into the elephant's flank, delivering medicine directly into his bloodstream. "And we need to debride this wound. It's gonna be painful, even if he's barely conscious." They worked quickly but carefully, 3 pairs of hands coordinated through long practice. The man held equipment, the other woman prepared medications, and the lead doctor, because that was clearly what she was, a veterinarian who specialized in large wildlife, began the delicate work of cutting away dead tissue from the wound. The elephant stirred. His trunk moved weakly. A sound emerged from his chest, not quite a rumble, more like a moan, and the oxpecker chirped in response, a soft sound of comfort or presence or solidarity. "Easy," the doctor murmured, though whether she was speaking to the elephant or to herself was unclear. "We're trying to help. Just let us help." The debriding took 20 minutes. The doctor removed necrotic tissue, cleaned the wound more thoroughly than the bird's beak could ever accomplish, applied antibiotic ointment, and then began the process of creating a protective covering, a large pad of gauze and bandage held in place with wraps that went around the elephant's entire shoulder and chest. The oxpecker watched every movement. She saw how the doctor's hands moved, saw where the medicine was applied, saw how the wound was covered and protected. She was learning, absorbing information her brain was not designed to process, storing it in whatever capacity for memory her small skull contained. When the bandaging was complete, the doctor sat back on her heels and wiped sweat from her forehead. "That's all we can do here," she said. "The antibiotics should bring down the infection if we got to him in time, but he needs to drink, needs to eat, he needs to want to live." "He's wanted to live this long," the man said quietly, and he gestured toward the bird on the elephant's head. "With help." The doctor looked at the oxpecker again, really looked this time, and her expression softened. "I saw the wound when we did the aerial survey yesterday," she said. "It was clean, cleaner than it should have been. I couldn't figure out how." She paused. "You've been taking care of him, haven't you, little one?" The bird chirped once, sharp and clear. The doctor smiled. Not the professional smile of someone doing their job, but something genuine, touched with wonder. "I've been doing this for 15 years, she said to her colleagues, "and I still see things that surprise me. Wild animals caring for each other across species lines. Every time I think I understand nature, it shows me something that doesn't fit any neat category." They gave the elephant 2 more injections, one for pain, one for inflammation, and then they began to pack up their equipment. The helicopter pilot had kept the rotor spinning at low idle, ready for immediate takeoff, and the humans moved with the efficiency of people who knew that every minute on the ground in the bush was a minute of risk. Before they left, the doctor knelt beside the elephant's head one more time. She reached out slowly, giving the oxpecker time to fly away if she chose, and she placed her hand on the bull's forehead just below where the bird perched. "Fight," she whispered to the unconscious elephant. "You fought this long. Fight a little longer." Then she stood, gathered her pack, and walked to the helicopter. The 3 humans climbed aboard. The rotors increased their speed, kicking up dust and debris. The oxpecker tucked her head against the wind, protecting her eyes, but she did not leave her position. The helicopter lifted, hovered for a moment, and then banked away toward the west, its sound fading gradually until the savanna's own noises returned. The wind in the acacias, the distant call of a fish eagle, the buzz of flies that were already investigating the elephant's new bandage. And then there was silence. The oxpecker raised her head and looked around. The bachelor herd had not returned. The clearing was empty, except for her and the elephant and the medical kit that still sat where the first human had left it, forgotten or deliberately abandoned, its purpose now fulfilled by more sophisticated means. The bull's breathing had changed. It was deeper now, more regular. The medications were working, battling back the infection that had been slowly killing him. But he was not conscious, not yet, and the bird had no way of knowing if he would wake, if the damage had gone too far, if all the care, both hers and the humans, had come too late. She hopped down from his head to his shoulder, carefully avoiding the new bandage. She examined it with her beak, testing its strength, understanding instinctively that this covering was important, that it should not be removed. Then she settled into a new position, not on the bandage, but beside it, and she began to sing. It was the song she had sung when he first tried to stand, the song of encouragement and presence and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. She sang it now with everything in her small body, pouring into it all the days of care and watching, all the nights of keeping guard, all the desperate hope that this massive life would continue, that the bond they had forged would not end in this dusty clearing with flies and silence and the indifferent African sun beating down on them both. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent. The shadows lengthened. And still the bird sang, and still the elephant breathed, and still the outcome hung in perfect, terrible uncertainty. Then, as the light turned golden and the heat began to ease, the elephant's eye opened. Not both eyes, just one, the eye on the side where the bird perched. It opened slowly, revealing brown iris and awareness and something that might have been confusion. The eye focused on the oxpecker, who had stopped singing the moment she felt the change in the body beneath her. They looked at each other, the tiny bird and the massive bull, and in that gaze was everything: recognition, gratitude, exhaustion, determination, fear, hope, and the wordless understanding that they had come through something together, that they were still coming through it, that the trial was not finished, but they were still here, still fighting, still alive. The elephant's trunk lifted slightly. It moved toward the bird, not threateningly, but gently, and the tip, sensitive as a finger, strong as steel, touched the oxpecker so lightly that it barely disturbed her feathers. The bird did not flinch. She leaned into the touch, her small body trusting the massive one, and she chirped once, soft, questioning. The elephant's trunk withdrew. His eye closed again, but this time it was not the closing of unconsciousness, but of rest, of conscious decision to sleep while healing happened, to trust in recovery, to surrender to process, while knowing that waking would come again. The oxpecker resumed her position beside the bandage. She did not sing now, but kept watch in silence, her bright eyes scanning the bush for threats, her small body alert and ready to sound alarm if danger approached. Night came slowly, painting the sky in layers of orange and purple and deep blue. The bachelor herd did not return, perhaps frightened too badly by the helicopter, perhaps having written off the wounded bull as lost, moving on in the way that animals must when survival demands hard choices. But the oxpecker stayed. Through the darkness, through the cold that came in the small hours before dawn, through the sounds of predators hunting and prey dying, and the eternal churning of the wild's cruel mathematics, she maintained her vigil. And when dawn broke on the second day after the human's intervention, the elephant stood. This time it was not the agonizing struggle of before. This time his legs obeyed, his balance held. His body, though still damaged, still healing, remembered what it was to be upright, to be functional, to be alive in ways that mattered beyond simple breathing. He stood in the gray light, swaying slightly, his wounded shoulder protected by the white bandage that made him look like he had been blessed by some strange spirit. And the oxpecker launched from his back and circled his head 3 times, calling, not in alarm, but in triumph, in celebration, in the pure expression of relief that defies species and circumstance. The elephant lifted his trunk and tested the air. He could smell water. The Savuti Channel was close. He could smell other elephants, somewhere, the bachelor herd or perhaps another group. But most of all, he could smell himself differently. Not the sick, sweet smell of infection, but the cleaner scent of healing, of medicine, of a body that had been pulled back from the edge and given another chance. He began to walk, and the bird returned to his shoulder, and together they moved toward the water, toward whatever came next, toward the life that had almost ended, but had somehow, impossibly, continued. The trial was not over. Healing would take weeks. The wound would leave a scar, and the wild's dangers did not pause for recovery. But they had passed through the worst together, the elephant and his unlikely guardian, and in doing so had created something that transcended the normal boundaries of nature, something that resembled what humans call friendship, but was really something older, something that had no name, because it lived in actions rather than words. They reached the channel by mid-morning. The elephant drank deeply, submerged his trunk, and drew water into his mouth and throat. and the bird flew to the muddy bank and drank beside him. And for a moment, they were simply two creatures sharing a resource, the way all living things do, the way life has always worked. But when the elephant turned to continue his journey, the bird did not seek out a new host. She returned to his shoulder, to her position beside the bandage, and she settled there as if she had always belonged in that spot, as if the universe had always intended for this specific bird to tend this specific elephant. And the elephant accepted her presence without question, without surprise, because some bonds, once forged in the fire of survival, cannot be broken by logic or convenience or the usual rules that govern how animals behave. They walked into the growing day together, and the forest itself seemed to take notice, seemed to wait for what would come next, seemed to recognize that something unusual had occurred in its midst, something that deserved witnessing, something that might matter in ways neither the bird nor the elephant could understand. And in a hollow baobab 3 kilometers away, the ranger who had first found the wounded elephant sat editing footage from the camera he had left running, watching on his small screen the entire sequence of events he had helped orchestrate: the bird's tireless care, the elephant's collapse, the helicopter rescue, and now the beginning of recovery. And he was crying quietly, because even people who work with animals every day can be undone by moments of grace, by examples of compassion that cross the boundaries humans assume are absolute. He would share this footage eventually. It would spread across the world, would be watched by millions, would inspire and move and remind people that nature is not just red in tooth and claw, but sometimes, rarely but really, shows a different face, a gentler truth, a possibility that transcends survival's brutal mathematics. But that was still to come. For now, in the immediate present, there was only the elephant and the bird, walking together through the tall grass, finding their rhythm, learning how to continue, writing the next chapter of a story that neither of them knew they were telling. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. 3 weeks passed before the bandage fell away. It happened naturally, loosening gradually as the wound beneath healed, as the elephant's movement and the elements did their work, until finally the last of it dropped from his shoulder and lay in the dust behind him. A white marker of intervention, of mercy, of the moment when human hands had reached across the divide to help. The wound beneath was closed.
The oxpecker ran across the elephant's shoulder, a permanent record of the snare's cruelty and the infection's hunger. But the skin had knitted together, new tissue had formed, and what had been a mortal injury was now simply a mark, a story written in flesh, a testament to survival against probability. The oxpecker examined it carefully that first morning, her beak tracing the scar's length, testing its integrity. Satisfied that her work and the human's work was complete, she finally took her first full meal in weeks, moving across the elephant's body with the efficient purpose of her kind, plucking ticks from behind his ears, from the folds of his legs, from the places she had neglected while focusing all her attention on the wound. The elephant had changed. Not just physically, though he had lost weight and would carry a limp for the rest of his life. The change was deeper, behavioral. He moved differently through the world, more carefully perhaps, or more thoughtfully. He no longer challenged other bulls, no longer tested boundaries. He had come through something that altered him at a fundamental level, the way trauma alters all creatures, leaving them softer in some ways and harder in others. And he stayed close to water. He had rejoined the bachelor herd briefly, but after a few days he had separated from them again, not out of pain or weakness, but out of choice. He established a small territory along the Savuti Channel, a stretch of riverbank with good grazing and reliable water, and he settled into a different kind of life, solitary but not isolated, peaceful but not passive, a bull who had learned that sometimes meant knowing when to stop fighting. The oxpecker stayed with him. She had opportunities to leave. Other elephants passed through regularly, healthy hosts who could carry her to better feeding grounds, to larger herds, to all the usual advantages her species sought.
But each time, she chose to return to the scarred bull, to the elephant who had become something more than convenient transportation, something more than the evolutionary partnership her genes insisted was the only thing that mattered. She had her routines now. Every morning, she would inspect the scar, checking for any sign of renewed infection or damage. Every evening, she would settle into her spot on his shoulder, not on the scar itself, but just beside it, and she would sing her soft song as the sun set and the night sounds began. And throughout the day, she would keep watch, her bright eyes scanning for threats, her sharp calls warning when danger approached. But gradually, something new began to happen. Other birds started to notice. First came a second oxpecker, a male, slightly larger than her, his red bill brighter in the sun. He arrived cautiously, landing on a nearby tree, watching the pair of them with evident curiosity. The female flew to confront him, her posture aggressive, territorial. But after a brief exchange of calls and threat displays, she relented. The elephant was large enough for two. The scar was healed. There was plenty of food. The male joined them, taking up position on the elephant's other side, and a new dynamic emerged. Two birds, one elephant, an expanded family of sorts. Then came others, more oxpeckers, attracted by the presence of the pair, by the reliable host, by something else they sensed but could not name. The story that hung over this particular elephant. The aura of having been saved, of being special in ways that transcended the normal hierarchy of the wild. Within a month, the scarred bull carried a small flock, 7 oxpeckers in total, each with their own position on his body, their own role in the collective work of keeping him clean and healthy. They squabbled occasionally, competed for the best feeding spots, but they also coordinated, their warning calls creating a network of protection that made the elephant one of the most alert animals in the territory. And the elephant seemed to appreciate their presence. He moved with a patience he had never shown before, careful not to disturb them when he walked or fed. He would stand motionless in the shade during the hottest part of the day, allowing them to groom him thoroughly, his eyes half closed in what might have been contentment. He had become, in his solitary way, the center of a small community, not a herd, but something else, a cross-species collective bound by mutual benefit and something that resembled affection. The original female, the one who had found him dying, who had cleaned his wound, who had stayed through everything, maintained her special status. She alone could land on his head. She alone would inspect the scar each morning. And when she called, the elephant's response was immediate, instinctive, the kind of trust that can only be built through shared trauma and survival. On the morning when everything changed, the elephant was feeding near the river's edge, pulling grass with his trunk. The oxpeckers scattered across his back like living jewels. The female was in her usual position, on his shoulder near the scar, when she suddenly went rigid. Her call was different from any she had made before. Not the alarm for predators, not the warning for humans, but something else, a high, urgent trilling that made all the other birds launch into the air immediately, circling, adding their voices to hers. The elephant raised his head, his trunk testing the air. He could sense something, but he could not identify it. The bird's agitation was clear, but its source remained mysterious. He began to move away from the river, following the female's flight pattern, trusting her judgment, even though he did not understand the threat. And then they emerged from the bush, the bachelor herd, or what was left of it. 4 young bulls instead of the original 6, their bodies showing signs of drought and hard travel. But walking with them, slightly apart but clearly part of the group, was a cow elephant. She was young, perhaps 15 years old, recently separated from her maternal herd or pushed out by a dominant matriarch. She moved with the uncertainty of someone navigating new social territory, staying close to the bulls for protection but maintaining the independent bearing of adult females. The scarred bull stopped. He watched the approaching group, his ears spread slightly, his posture neither aggressive nor welcoming. The bachelor herd recognized him. Their rumbles carried notes of surprise and what might have been gladness. They had thought him dead, had mourned and moved on, and now here he stood, scarred but alive, changed but present. But it was the cow who interested the oxpeckers. The female landed on a low branch, watching intently as the young cow approached the scarred bull. The 2 elephants touched trunks, brief, exploratory, tentative. The cow examined his scar with evident curiosity, her trunk tracing its length the way the bird's beak had done months ago. And then something passed between them, some elephant communication too subtle for birds or humans to interpret. And the cow remained close. She did not join the bachelor herd when they moved on to feed. She stayed with the scarred bull, and he did not drive her away. The oxpeckers watched this development with what seemed like approval. The female flew back to the bull's shoulder, landing on her spot, and she began to sing. Not the comfort song, but something brighter, something that sounded remarkably like celebration. And when the cow settled near the bull to rest, when she leaned her body slightly against his in the way elephants do when they feel safe, when the 2 of them stood together in the dappled shade of the acacias, the oxpecker's song continued, rising above the whisper of the river and the buzz of afternoon insects, a sound that seemed to acknowledge that life continues, that stories do not end but transform, that survival leads not just to more survival, but sometimes to new beginnings. Days passed. The cow remained. The scarred bull and the young cow developed their own rhythms, feeding together, traveling together, resting together. They were not a breeding pair, not yet, but something was forming between them, a bond built on the quiet understanding that elephants somehow manage without words or gestures, a recognition of compatible temperaments, of mutual needs for companionship and protection. And then, one morning, the cow began to behave strangely. She was restless, moving away from the bull and then returning, her trunk touching her own belly repeatedly, her ears flicking in agitation. The oxpeckers noticed immediately, their calls shifting to a questioning tone. The scarred bull noticed too. He followed the cow closely, his trunk touching her side, his rumbles low and concerned. And when she finally settled in a sheltered spot among the fever trees, when her breathing changed and her body began the ancient work of bringing new life into the world, he positioned himself between her and the rest of the world, a guard, a protector, a presence. The birth took hours. The sun climbed and peaked and began its descent. The oxpeckers maintained their watch, unusually quiet, sensing the importance of what was happening. And when the calf finally emerged, wet and trembling and impossibly small compared to its mother, when it took its first breath and made its first sound and struggled to its feet with the determination all newborns possess, the female oxpecker began to sing again. It was the same song she had sung when the bull first stood after nearly dying, the same song she had sung during the darkest hours of his infection. But now it carried different meaning, not comfort for suffering, but celebration of renewal, not encouragement for survival, but welcome for new arrival, not dirge, but anthem. The other oxpeckers joined her, their voices creating a chorus that rose above the fever trees and spread across the savanna. And the elephants, the scarred bull, the young cow, and the newborn calf, stood together in the golden light, a family not born of blood, but assembled through circumstance and need and the strange mathematics of survival that occasionally produces beauty instead of loss. The female oxpecker flew to the calf, landing on its small back, the first of what would be many such landings over the years to come. The calf, startled, tried to shake her off, but she held on with practiced ease, and after a moment the calf settled, accepting her presence the way its father by choice had learned to accept it months ago. And in that moment, something completed. The circle that had begun with a wounded elephant and a cleaning bird closed not with death or separation, but with continuation, with new life, with the possibility that what had been saved would go on saving, that care would multiply across generations, that the story would not end but would echo forward into time. The forest had waited for her song. The savanna had held its breath through wound and healing, through trial and transformation. And now, with the song rising and the new calf standing, and the scarred bull watching over both cow and baby with the protectiveness of someone who knows how fragile life is, how quickly it can be lost, how precious it is when preserved, now the forest could exhale, could resume its rhythms, could fold this story into its endless collection of moments both terrible and wonderful. The sun set behind the escarpment, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The oxpeckers settled on the three elephants, the bull, the cow, and the calf, their small bodies arranged like guardian spirits across the massive forms. And the female, in her special position on the bull's shoulder near the scar, sang one last time before darkness came, a soft, gentle melody that said, "We are here. We are alive. We continue." The night arrived with its usual swiftness, bringing stars and sounds and all the dangers that darkness always holds. But in the sheltered place beneath the fever trees, the small family rested, protected by size and number, and the alertness of the birds, who would not sleep deeply, who would maintain their watch through all the hours until dawn. And when morning came, when the sun broke over the horizon and washed the savanna in new light, the elephants would rise and begin another day. The calf would learn to walk, to feed, to navigate the world into which it had been born. The cow would teach and protect, and the scarred bull would stand guard, his body marked by survival, his presence a testament to the possibility that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the wild shows mercy, that care crosses boundaries thought absolute, that a tiny bird can save an elephant, and an elephant can remember. The female oxpecker would stay with them, of course, through seasons and storms, through droughts and floods, through all the challenges that life in Africa presents. She would tend the calf as she had tended the bull, would keep watch as she had always kept watch, would sing her songs of warning and comfort and celebration, would fulfill the contract that had never spoken, but that both she and the elephant understood perfectly. And years later, when researchers would ask the ranger what became of the wounded elephant and the bird who saved him, he would show them footage of 3 elephants and a flock of oxpeckers moving together through the fever trees, and he would say simply, "They stayed together. They made a family." Nature doesn't always follow our rules. Sometimes it writes its own stories, and they're better than anything we could imagine. The forest had waited for her song, and she had given it, not once but many times, in darkness and in light, in fear and in hope, in trial and in triumph. She had given it, and the forest had listened, and the listening had mattered. Because in the wild, where survival is mathematics and death is common and mercy is rare, the moments when creatures care for each other across the boundaries of species, when compassion appears where only instinct should exist, when tiny birds save giant elephants and elephants remember. These moments are the forest's true heartbeat, the pulse beneath the violence, the reason why those who know the wild best never lose their capacity for wonder. The story ended not with an ending, but with continuation. The scar on the elephant's shoulder would fade over time, but never disappear entirely. The bond between bird and elephant would deepen with years, would become a fixture of that stretch of the Savuti, would be witnessed by other animals and human observers, and would become, in its own small way, legendary. But on that first morning after the calf's birth, as the sun climbed and the heat began to build, and the three elephants began their slow walk toward water, none of that mattered. What mattered was the present moment, the calf's uncertain steps, the cow's patient guidance, the bull's steady presence, and the bird's watchful song. What mattered was that they were alive, together, continuing. And in the vast indifference of the universe, in the grinding wheel of evolution, in the cold calculations of survival, that small fact, that one wounded elephant and one small bird had found each other and had held on through everything and had created something that resembled love, that fact was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.